There is a kind of tired that sleep cannot touch, a kind of hunger that food does not reach, a kind of loneliness that exists even in a room full of voices. If you have ever known that kind of tired, then you already know where this story begins. Not at a beginning, really, more like the middle of a long road, at the point where the person walking it has forgotten why they started, forgotten what the destination looked like, forgotten even the sound of their own name spoken with kindness. This is the story of a man named Yusuf, not a famous man, not a man history will remember, a man whose name is shared by millions, which is perhaps the point, because this story does not belong to one person. It belongs to anyone who has ever looked at their own reflection and not recognized what they saw. Anyone who has sat at the edge of their bed in the early morning, before the world woke up to demand things from them, and felt the weight of every compromise they had ever made pressing down on their chest like stone. Yusuf was 41 years old when the story we are telling reaches its most important hour. But to understand that hour, you have to walk backward through many years. You have to see the boy before the man. You have to understand how a person becomes a stranger to themselves, slowly, over many seasons, through 1,000 small surrenders that each seemed reasonable at the time. He was born in a village where the houses were made of clay and the summers were merciless. His mother was a woman who rose before the sun and went to sleep after it. And in between those two darknesses, she worked with her hands without complaint. She did not teach Yusuf lessons with words. She taught him by the way she kneaded bread at 4 in the morning, her forearms thick and certain, her face calm even when the flour was nearly gone. She taught him that quiet endurance was not weakness, that a person who did not collapse was a person who had something anchored deep inside them that the wind could not reach. His father was different, not a cruel man, but a man who had learned to measure everything in terms of what other people thought. The neighbors' opinions were a kind of currency in their household. If the neighbors believed they were doing well, then they were doing well. If the neighbors looked at them with respect, then they were respectable. Yusuf watched his father adjust himself constantly, bending this way and that, like a young tree in a courtyard that grows toward whatever window of light it is allowed to reach. His father was not a bad man. He was a frightened man, and frightened men pass their fear like inheritance to their sons. Wrapped in the clothing of advice. Yusuf was told, from the time he was old enough to understand sentences, that his worth was attached to the approval of others, that a good life meant a life others could point to without embarrassment, that ambition was acceptable only when it fit inside the shape that the community had already agreed upon. Study what is useful, work where there is security, marry when you are stable. Never raise your voice about the things that matter to you, because wanting things that other people do not understand makes you strange, and strange people do not have good lives. He was not told these things in cruelty, he was told them in love, and that made them harder to question, because how do you push against something that comes towards you wearing the face of someone who loves you? By the time Yusuf was 23, he had made every expected choice. He had studied accounting because his uncle said there would always be work for accountants. He had taken a job at a firm where the ceilings were low and the fluorescent lights hummed all day, and the windows, when there were windows, looked out onto the wall of the building next door. He had a salary, he had a schedule, he had a small apartment with furniture chosen because it was inexpensive, not because he liked it. He had, in every external measure, become the kind of young man his father could introduce to the neighbors without lowering his eyes. But there was something Yusuf had put in a room inside himself and locked the door, something that had been there since childhood, urgent and alive and pressing against that locked door every morning when he woke up. He had always wanted to build things, not buildings, necessarily, but things, systems, ideas, solutions. He had a mind that saw connections between problems, the way some people see shapes in clouds, naturally, without effort, sometimes annoyingly. He had notebooks from adolescence filled with plans for things that did not yet exist, drawn in the margins of his schoolwork, half finished because there was never time to finish them, never a person to show them to who would not smile the polite, dismissive smile of someone watching a child describe a dream. He had wanted to start something of his own, a small business, even a very small one, something that was his, something he could build with his own hands and his own mind and stand beside it and say, "This came from me." But his father had said the risk was too great. His uncle had said he was being unrealistic. His first girlfriend, who later became someone else's wife, had said that dreamers make for difficult husbands. And Yusuf, who had been taught since childhood to hear other people's voices more clearly than his own, had locked the door and walked away from it and tried to forget the sound of the knocking. Years passed away, water passes through cupped hands. You think you are holding them, and then you look, and they are gone, and your palms are only damp. He married a woman named Samira. She was practical and not unkind, and she had grown up in a household very similar to his, where life was organized around stability, and stability was understood as the absence of surprise. They were not unhappy, exactly. They were something harder to name. They were two people who had each made a long series of compromises in order to become acceptable, and who had then found each other in that acceptability and built a home there. In the land of good enough, they had a son. They named him Adam, and Adam was, from his first days, the kind of child who looked at the world with enormous, unblinking eyes, as though he was afraid of missing something. He was always asking why. Why does the sky change color? Why do some people live in bigger houses? Why does his father come home from work looking like someone walked on him? Yusuf would answer these questions patiently for a while, and then, when the questions got too close to something he did not want to examine, he would grow quiet. And the quietness was its own kind of answer. And Adam, being a perceptive child, heard it. Yusuf was 31 when he first noticed that something in him had gone dim, not broken, not destroyed, just dim, like a lamp that is still on, but has been turned down so low that it gives off more shadow than light. He would sit in the office beneath the humming fluorescents and do the work and do it well and feel nothing. He would come home and eat and sit and sometimes watch television without knowing what he was watching. He would lie awake at night and stare at the ceiling and feel a heaviness in his chest that was not quite sadness, but was not quite not sadness either. He did not know what to call it. He did not know enough about himself by that point to have the vocabulary. It was in the 33rd year of his life that the first real crack appeared. Not in his life, exactly. In him. He was sitting in a meeting at the office. Someone was presenting numbers on a screen. Someone else was asking about projections. The voices in the room around him around a stone. And Yusuf, for the first time in a long time, heard himself. Not his voice, his silence. He heard it the way you sometimes hear a sound, only after it has stopped, suddenly aware of the absence of something. He heard the silence of all the things he had never said, all the ideas he had never pursued, all the mornings he had woken up and chosen the safe path, without even pausing to feel the weight of the choice. He excused himself and went to the bathroom and stood at the sink and ran cold water over his wrists. He looked at his face in the mirror. He looked at the lines around his eyes, which were not old lines, but tired lines. He looked at the set of his jaw, which had become the jaw of a man who has been clenching his teeth for years. He looked at his own eyes and tried to remember the last time he had looked at himself and felt something other than neutrality. He could not remember. That was the crack. Not a dramatic collapse, not a sudden revelation, just the quiet, devastating recognition that somewhere along the long road of becoming acceptable, he had lost the thread back to himself, and he did not know how long ago he had lost it, which meant he did not know how far he had to walk to find it again. He did not tell Samira. This was the first mistake, though it seemed like protection at the time. He did not tell her because he did not have the words, and because he was afraid that if he said aloud that he felt lost inside his own life, she would hear it as an accusation, as if the life they had built together was the cage. And it was not a cage, not exactly, but it was a room built too small for the person he had been before the compromises, and he had been trying for years to convince himself that he had shrunk enough to fit it comfortably, he began to withdraw. Slowly, the way ice forms on water, almost invisibly at first. He spoke less at dinner. He sat longer on the balcony in the evenings, staring at the street below without watching it. Adam would come and stand beside him sometimes, small shoulder pressed against his arm, saying nothing, offering the particular comfort of a child who does not yet know how to fix things, but knows how to be present. Those moments were the most honest of Yusuf's days. In those moments, he did not have to perform stability. He could simply be what he was, which was a man in the middle of a long confusion, watching the lights come on in the apartments across the street as the city settled into its evening dot at work. He began to make small errors, nothing catastrophic, but small, the kind that accumulate like water damage, invisible until the wall gives way. His mind was somewhere else. His mind had gone looking for something, and his body was still at the desk, still answering emails, still attending meetings. But the part of him that made the work meaningful, the part that cared about doing it well, had wandered off somewhere, and he could not call it back. His manager called him in one afternoon and spoke to him with the careful, measured tone of a person delivering a warning wrapped in concern. He said that Yusuf seemed distracted lately, that his recent work had not been up to his usual standard, that he hoped everything was all right at home. He said all the right things in the right order, and Yusuf sat across the desk and nodded and said yes, everything was fine, just some personal things would sort itself out, and walked back to his desk and sat down and felt, for the first time in years, something sharp and specific, where before there had only been dull weight. He felt humiliation, not at the criticism itself, which was fair, but at the realization that he was now failing at the thing he had sacrificed everything else to be good at. He had given up his dreams to be reliable. He had given up his voice to be acceptable. He had given up the room inside himself where his real self lived in order to become the kind of man his father could be proud of. And now, even that bargain was breaking. Even the security he had bought with all those surrenders was beginning to dissolve, which meant he had given everything away and gotten nothing in return. He had paid the price and the merchant had pocketed the coins and handed him an empty bag. That night he did not sleep. He lay in the dark and listened to the sound of Samira's breathing beside him, steady and deep, and the sound was both comfort and reproach. She was sleeping because she had made peace with the life they had. He was awake because he had not, and the difference between them, which had always been there but blurred at the edges, now felt stark and clear. A line drawn down the middle of the bed, of the room, of the years they had spent together, he began, in those sleepless nights, to think about the notebooks, the ones from his adolescence, filled with half-finished ideas in the margins. He did not know if he still had them. He had not thought about them in more than a decade. But lying in the dark, he found that he could reconstruct them from memory, page by page, idea by idea, with a clarity that surprised him. His mind had been keeping them all this time, tucked away behind the accounts receivable and the quarterly reports, and the dinner table conversations about school fees and grocery prices. All this time, that part of him had been waiting, quietly, without complaint, the way his mother used to wait, just present, just patient, just there. He began to get up before dawn, silently, so as not to wake Samira. He would go to the kitchen table and sit with a cup of tea and a blank notebook, and he would write, not the polished thoughts of a man who knows where he is going, the rough, uncertain thoughts of a man feeling his way in the dark. Some mornings he would write for an hour and produce nothing worth keeping. Some mornings a single sentence would appear that felt like stepping from shadow into light, not blinding, not miraculous, just real, just honest, just his. He did not tell anyone he was doing this. It felt too fragile to expose, like a new plant that needs to be kept from the wind until its roots go deep enough to hold it. 3 months passed, then 6. He was still waking before dawn. The notebooks were filling. He had written his way back to something he recognized, a way of seeing problems, a way of imagining solutions, a voice on the page that sounded more like him than anything he had said aloud in years. And slowly, from that writing, an idea had formed, not a grand idea, A small one, modest and specific, a service he could offer, something that used what he genuinely knew, that solved a real problem, that he had thought through carefully over those quiet morning hours. He told Samira on a Thursday evening. Adam had gone to bed. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her, haltingly, everything, not just the idea, but the years before it, the crack at the sink, the humiliation in the manager's office, the notebooks, the sleepless nights. He told her that he felt he had been living beside his own life for a long time, and that he wanted to change that, and that the change he imagined was not reckless. He was not asking her to support a fantasy. He was asking her to believe in something he had thought about carefully and built slowly, and now wanted to bring into the light. She was quiet for a long time, long enough for him to feel the old fear rising, the fear of being called unrealistic, the fear of the polite dismissing smile. And then she said something he had not expected. She said she had known for years that something in him was not right. She said she had watched him dim like a lamp turned to low, and had not known how to name it or reach it. She said she was afraid of the change he was describing, but she was more afraid of watching him disappear further into the grey place he had been inhabiting. She said she would not stand in his way. And then she said something that struck him like light through a closed window. She said that she had married him, the real him, not the performance he had given for all these years. She wanted to meet him. He was not prepared for how hard it would be. He had spent 6 months building the idea in the safety of early mornings, when no one could evaluate it or reduce it or find its weaknesses. When he brought it into the world had opinions. He spoke to people who told him the market was already served. He applied for a small loan and was turned down because he had no track record as a business owner. He told his father, who received the news with the particular silence of a man who believes he is watching his son make a mistake, but loves him too much to fight it openly. His uncle said nothing at all, which said everything. His first client came from an unexpected direction. A woman who ran a small catering business from her home and needed help organizing her finances, and she had heard from someone who had heard from someone that Yusuf was doing something on his own. The fee she paid was modest, but when he sat with her and worked through her numbers and watched her face change from anxious to understood, something happened in him that had not happened at his desk under the fluorescent lights in 18 years of reliable employment. He felt it. He felt the work. It moved through him and meant something. It connected to the part of him that had been knocking at the locked door for so long. He went home that evening and Adam ran to him at the door, as children do, and Yusuf picked him up and held him, and the boy looked at his face and said, "You look different." And Yusuf said, "Different how?" And Adam, who was 9 years old, and therefore still had access to a kind of truth that adults unlearn, said, "You look like you again." But the hardest part of returning to yourself is not the first steps. The hardest part is the long middle, the part where you have left the safety of the old life, but have not yet reached the solidity of the new one, where you are standing in open water, out of reach of both shores, where you are living on faith more than evidence, on mornings more than outcomes, on the small voice inside you that says keep walking in a world that is very good at saying stop. There were months where the income was not enough, where Yusuf did the calculations at the kitchen table and the numbers were honest in the way that numbers always are, brutally, without comfort. He took on additional work to bridge the gaps, unglamorous work, work that had nothing to do with his vision, work that reminded him painfully of the life he had stepped away from. He did it without complaint. He did it the way his mother used to knead bread before sunrise, with the quiet understanding that the work was not the destination, but was part of the road. Samira took on extra shifts at the school where she worked. She did this without making him feel the sacrifice as debt. She did it the way people who love without keeping score do things, plainly, because it was needed. He saw her do it and felt gratitude that was too large for words and too important for silence. And so he showed it in small ways, in the ways that people who are too tired for grand gestures show love. By being present, by staying awake to listen, by making the tea and leaving it on her desk without being asked. Adam watched all of this, He was old enough to feel the tension in the house without understanding its shape. There were evenings when the dinner table was quieter than it should have been, and the quiet pressed against all three of them differently. Yusuf was aware of his son watching him, the way children watch parents when they are trying to understand what life is, what kind of thing the future is, whether it opens or closes. He tried, in those moments, to be the answer he would have wanted when he was 9 years old. He tried to show, not with speeches, but with the texture of his daily choices, that difficulty was not the same as failure, that uncertainty was not the same as being lost, that a person could be in the middle of something hard and still be intact, still be whole, still be themselves. In the second year, something shifted, not a dramatic shift, more like the way a river slowly changes course. You don't see it happening in any single moment, but you look one day and the water is moving differently than it was before. He had built a small list of regular clients. Word had moved, the way word moves in communities where trust is the main currency, from one neighbor to another, from one small business owner to the next. He was not prosperous, but he was sustainable. He had passed from the open water into a place where he could feel ground beneath his feet, unsteady still, not yet solid, but there. But more than the business, something had changed in how he carried himself. His mother, who was old now and saw him rarely, told him when he visited that he walked differently. He asked her what she meant. She looked at him for a long moment, the way mothers look when they are seeing something they knew would happen and waited a long time to see. She said he walked like a man who knows where he is, like a man who has somewhere to go that he chose himself. He thought about that 4 weeks afterward. He turned it over in his hands, the way you turn an unfamiliar object, feeling its weight, its edges. He had spent so many years walking toward places other people had pointed to, toward the degree his uncle recommended, toward the firm where security was promised, toward the life that others recognized as good. And he had walked all those roads dutifully and arrived at all those places and stood there and felt the bewildering emptiness of a person who has reached a destination that was never really theirs. Now, he was walking somewhere he had chosen. It was harder. The road was less certain. There were no markers because no one else had walked this specific path before him. But the walking felt different. It felt connected to something inside him other than something outside him. And that connection, that simple, fundamental alignment between what he was doing and who he was a kind of wealth he had no frame of reference for before, because no one had told him it existed. No one in his childhood had named it. No one had said that the most important project of a human life is the project of becoming yourself, and that everything else, the work, the relationships, the small daily acts, are only meaningful to the degree that they are connected to that central project. He had a conversation with his father that he had been afraid to have for 40 years. It was a Sunday afternoon. His father was old now, diminished by time, the way old men become diminished, his edges softer, his voice quieter. The certainty he had once carried like armor and now replaced by something that might have been wisdom or might have been simple tiredness. It was difficult to tell the difference. They were sitting in his parents' garden, in the shade of the old tree that had been there longer than Yusuf's memory, in the same chairs they always sat in, drinking the same tea they always drank. Yusuf told him about the years of the locked door. He told him carefully, without accusation, because he had done enough thinking by now to understand that his father had given him what his father had been given, had passed on the fear that had been passed to him, and that this was not cruelty but inheritance, the most human kind, the kind that is handed from one frightened person to the next down through the generations, each one meaning well, each one unaware of what they are passing along. He told him that he had spent most of his adult life treating his own worth as something to be approved by others, and that he had only recently begun to understand that worth was not something you received from outside yourself, that it was something you recognized in yourself, something you tended and protected and built upon, something as basic and non-negotiable as the right to breathe. His father listened. He did not speak for a long time. The garden was quiet except for the sound of birds in the old tree. When he finally spoke, he said that he had been afraid his whole life. He said it simply, without drama, as if reporting the weather. He said he had learned early that the world was dangerous, and that safety was found in the opinions of others, and he had lived his whole life organized around that belief and had passed it to his son, without knowing he was passing it. He said he was sorry, not in a grand way, in the quiet way of a man who has seen something clearly, possibly for the first time, and is responding to what he sees. Yusuf put his hand over his father's hand. They did not say anything else for a while. They sat in the shade of the old tree and drank their tea, and the garden held them in its quiet afternoon light, and it was enough. Adam was 12 by the year Yusuf's business became something he could look at without anxiety. Not large, not famous, but real and growing, and filled with the kind of work that connected to the person doing it. By 12, Adam had his own notebooks. He had discovered his father's habit of early morning writing and had begun his own version of it, sitting at the kitchen table in the half-dark before school, filling pages with the particular urgency of a boy who has too many thoughts for the day to contain. One morning, Yusuf came into the kitchen and found his son sitting there, hunched over a notebook, face close to the page, and the image stopped him in the doorway. He stood and watched his son write and felt something move through him that was not quite any one emotion, but contained all of them. Pride and tenderness and grief and hope, all at once. The way certain chords contain multiple notes that cannot be separated. He did not interrupt. He made his tea quietly and sat at the other end of the table and opened his own notebook, and they sat together in the early morning darkness, father and son, to people writing their separate thoughts in the same silence, and the silence was the most honest thing in the room. He thought about all the versions of himself that might have existed if he had started earlier. The years in the middle, the years of the fluorescent lights and the humming and the locked door, were not wasted, exactly. Nothing is ever entirely wasted, but they were heavy with the weight of what might have been. He allowed himself to feel that weight, not to be crushed by it, but to feel it honestly. He did not push it away with the reassurance that everything happens for a reason, because he did not know if that was true, and he had stopped saying things he did not know were true. He simply felt it. The cost, the years, the roads not taken. He held them in his hands for a moment, and then he set them down. Because here is what he had learned, not as a lesson, not as something someone told him, as something he had lived his way to, foot by foot, morning by morning, mistake by mistake. He had learned that a person who does not value themselves becomes a room without walls. Everyone walks through and takes what they want and leaves the cold wind behind them. He had been that room 4 years. He had opened himself to every opinion, every expectation, every voice that was louder than his own, and he had organized his life around what those voices approved of, and he had diminished slowly, reliably, in the way that things diminish when they are not tended. He had learned that the moment you begin to take yourself seriously is not a moment of arrogance. It is a moment of responsibility to yourself, to the people who depend on you, to the boy watching you from across the dinner table, learning what a life looks like by watching yours. You cannot give what you have given away. You cannot build anything from a foundation you have allowed to erode. The work of becoming yourself is not separate from the work of loving others. It is the ground that makes all other work possible. He had learned that patience is not passive. He had watched his mother her whole life and thought her patience was submission, was acceptance, was the silence of someone who had learned not to want too much. But looking back from where he now stood, he could see it differently. Her patience was not emptiness, it was rootedness. She had known who she was, deeply, certainly, without requiring the confirmation of anyone outside herself. She had been patient not because she expected nothing, but because she trusted the long view. She could wait because she was not afraid of time. She was not afraid of time because she was not afraid of herself. He had learned that the small daily acts of showing up for your own life, the early mornings, the filled notebooks, the hard conversations, The work done without applause are not preparation for something else. They are the thing itself. Life is not a corridor you walk through to reach a room where the real living happens. The corridor is the room. The walking is the arriving. The mornings in the kitchen with his son, the conversations with Samira, the visits to his aging father in the garden, the clients he sat with and really listened to. These were not steps toward a better life. They were the life, actual and irreplaceable and happening right now, while he was present enough to receive it. Yusuf is 41 years old, and it is an ordinary Tuesday morning. Adam is in school. Samira has gone to work. The apartment is quiet in the particular way of a home that is usually full, a quiet that contains the memory of voices. He's sitting at the kitchen table with his tea and his notebook, and the sun is coming through the window at the angles only reaches in autumn, long and amber, and without intensity. The kind of light that does not demand anything of you, that simply arrives and offers itself. He opens his notebook. He sits for a moment with the empty page. He does not rush to fill it. He has learned that the empty page is not a failure. It is a possibility. It is the space in which something might happen, if he is patient, if he is present, if he trusts himself enough to wait. He thinks about the boy he was at 23, sitting in the office beneath the fluorescent lights, hearing the faint knocking from behind the locked door and choosing, morning after morning, not to open it. He does not think about him with contempt. He thinks about him with the particular compassion you feel for someone who was doing their best with what they had, who was afraid in all the ways that young people are afraid, who had not yet found the courage to trust the voice inside him more than the voices outside. He would not go back, but if he could send something back, if he could reach through the years and leave something on the desk of that 23-year-old man sitting under the humming lights, he would not leave advice. He would leave permission. Permission to take himself seriously. Permission to believe that the things that mattered to him were worth mattering to. Permission to fail at something chosen rather than succeed at something borrowed. Permission to open the door. Outside the window, a sparrow lands on the ledge and looks in, and then looks away, indifferent to everything, interested in everything, entirely itself. The amber light stretches further across the floor. The notebook is still open. The morning is still here. He picks up his pen and he begins. There is a kind of tired that sleep cannot touch, but there is also a kind of rest that has nothing to do with sleep. It is the rest of a person who has stopped fighting against themselves, who has stopped spending their energy maintaining a performance and redirected it towards something true. It is not a dramatic rest. It is not announced by any trumpet. It arrives quietly, the way the best things arrive, in an ordinary morning, in a cup of tea, in the amber light of a Tuesday, in the scratch of a pen across a blank page. Not every story ends with rescue. Not every journey ends with arrival at some imagined place of safety and triumph. Some stories end with a person, simply and finally, becoming themselves, which is, in its quiet way, the longest journey, the hardest territory, the one that requires more courage than any other, because the only obstacle on that road was ever the story you kept telling yourself about who you were allowed to be. Yusuf is 41 years old. He's not famous. He's not wealthy. He's not the man his father imagined, or his uncle advised, or his younger self tried to become. He's only himself. But for the first time in a very long time, that is not a diminishment. That is not a consolation prize. That is the whole thing. The pen moves. The morning holds. The amber light stays just a little longer than it has any reason to. And that, in the end, is enough.